How much does a man have to bleed before the world stops treating him like dirt? We think we know success. We think we spot a winner instantly. But what if the dirtiest boots hold the deepest pockets? Today, we peel back the polished facade of respectability and witness the brutal moment when arrogance costs a fortune. This is the sanctuary, not a church, but a John Deere dealership, a gleaming temple of finance and heavy iron. Everything here is clean, sharp, professional. The AC hums a silent, wealthy song, filtering out the reality of sun and soil. It's where business happens, sanitized from the work itself. Standing guard is Julian, a man measured by his cufflinks, pressed suit, hair perfect. Julian doesn't just sell tractors, he sells the idea of being important. His whole posture is a quiet insult to anyone who looks less than perfect. He sees the world in two columns, clients and time wasters. Then the front door swings wide and the air changes. No physical disruption. He doesn't walk in, he drags the reality of the outside world onto the pristine porcelain tiles. A man built like an old oak, covered head to toe in red clay and diesel smut. His work boots leave thick black streaks. He smells of sweat and hard harvest. He looks like a ghost that just climbed out of a shallow grave. The contrast is immediate, almost painful. Julian stares, not with respect, but with instant, icy contempt. The man, still radiating the heat of the harvest, lumbered past the display models. Julian, glued to his spot like a statue of modern contempt, watched the grease streaks desecrate the pristine floor. The farmer didn't look at Julian. He looked through him. His eyes, the color of burnt umber, scanned the showroom's crown jewels, the massive S790 combines. These weren't farming machines. They were moving financial institutions, each one costing more than Julian's annual salary. The farmer finally stopped, planted his heavy boots right in front of the specifications plaque. He didn't blink, but there was a strange stillness in his gaze, less focused on the glossy red paint and more on the obscured, distant fields outside the tinted windows, fields Julian had never set foot in. There was a story behind that faraway look, a history of dirt and decisions yet untold. Julian cleared his throat, ready to deploy the standard dismissal, a polite but firm guidance toward the pre-owned section, perhaps a smaller 600 series. "Sir, those models require—" The farmer cut him off with the blunt force of a snapped chain. His voice was low, gravelly, completely devoid of performance anxiety. "I'll take 3 of those S790 combines." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, a multi-million-dollar declaration delivered with the casualness of ordering coffee. 3. That wasn't a farmer buying equipment. That was an empire making an acquisition. Julian's spine locked. His carefully constructed professional facade wavered. The purchase was staggering, but what struck Julian harder was the man's dirty right hand, which had briefly shifted, exposing a thick band of dull yellow gold beneath the clay and diesel smudges, a ring that clearly wasn't costume jewelry. The declaration was an outrageous joke, but the gold felt real. Julian forced a smile, tight and predatory. 3? That's a serious proposition, sir. We're talking about the premium connectivity package, high-end powertrain protection. The farmer nodded once. The platinum maintenance, full 12-year warranty on the engine block. We need the uptime assurance. Julian blinked. Platinum maintenance was an industry term reserved only for clients managing thousands of acres and operating multiple satellite tracking systems. It wasn't something a walk-in mud-caked dreamer would know. The implication was immediate and terrifying. This man knew exactly what he was asking for. A nervous tremor shot through Julian's perfect posture. This was either the most colossal waste of time in his career or a disaster waiting to happen. Julian's immediate reaction wasn't professional. It was visceral. A hot wave of offense washed over him. He felt personally insulted that this walking pile of manure thought he could command such expensive iron. He subtly took a step back, trying not to let the grime contaminate his tailored Italian wool. Analyzing the thick, reddish-brown residue coating the man's boots, Julian suddenly recognized the unique mineral composition. This wasn't just any dirt. It was the heavy clay from the disputed prime agricultural land along the North Fork Valley, the region notoriously undervalued, but known to yield legendary harvests. Julian let the air rush out of his lungs in a sharp, derisive exhale, followed by a loud, theatrical burst of condescending laughter that echoed off the polished steel. "Ha! Ah, I needed that, truly. Look, pal, I appreciate the enthusiasm. I really do. But we need to talk metrics here. Financing these units requires stringent amortization schedules, detailed asset liquidity metrics. You understand, this isn't a starter tractor. He stopped laughing abruptly, his face hardening. The farmer, however, remained completely still, his eyes now briefly lifting, not looking at Julian's face but at the framed Salesman of the Year certificate mounted just over Julian's shoulder, a silent assessment of the trophy. Julian hated the quiet judgment in that glance. "Standard procedure, friend," Julian said, voice dripping with false sincerity. "Before we waste time, I need proof of funds. Certified bank statement, perhaps. We usually reserve this equipment for clients who can prove they won't be defaulting by October. Maybe we can show you our selection of reliable pre-owned grain carts." The farmer reached slowly into the chest pocket of his overalls, the denim worn thin and faded almost white. Julian mentally prepared for the sight of a thin, pathetic wad of cash. Instead, the man produced a folded slip of heavy paper, stained with grease, and placed it gently on the top of the S790 brochure resting nearby. It wasn't a bank statement, it was a recent BL bill of lading for a shipment of over 500,000 bushels of corn delivered to the Port Authority last week, a number that implied an operation of immense scale and immediate cash flow. "The order is firm," the farmer stated, his eyes returning to Julian. "I need them delivered and field ready by the 17th. Pre-season rush is upon us." Julian blinked, momentarily speechless. The 17th. That date specifically coincided with the heavily anticipated announcement of the new state-backed disaster relief and infrastructure grants, a program designed to inject liquidity into massive farming operations. Did this man have inside information? Julian scoffed, recovering quickly. He couldn't let paperwork intimidate him. "Field ready? Sir, frankly, looking at the condition of your boots, I seriously doubt your current operation has the logistical bandwidth, let alone the acreage, to warrant one S790, let alone 3. These are highly sophisticated tools for serious players, not toys." The farmer tilted his head slightly. "The new 13.6L PowerTech. We'll need the updated ECU calibration for the high humidity runs. I heard there were still some issues with the hydrostatic drive's thermal efficiency under sustained load. Have those service bulletins been cleared?" Julian paled. He had memorized the sales brochure details, horsepower, width, capacity, but the technical specifics of the ECU and hydrostatic thermal efficiency were maintenance-level details that even many long-time customers wouldn't grasp. Julian only knew the sticker price. The farmer knew the machine's heartbeat. A cold dread began to pool in Julian's stomach. He adjusted his tie, feeling the sweat start to prickle his hairline. The charade was spiraling out of his control. He needed to assert authority immediately. "Look," Julian snapped, his voice tight, "I'm done with the games. Right now I need certified bank statements, a letter of credit from an accredited institution, or a cashier's check for the full amount. This is a dealership, not a museum." From the corner of the showroom, the junior sales associate Marcus, who specialized in parts, was watching the exchange intently. Marcus subtly, almost imperceptibly, shook his head at Julian, a clear, frantic signal of warning. Julian missed it, focused only on humiliating the obstacle in front of him. The farmer shifted his weight, the clay on his boots grating loudly against the polished floor. He reached slowly into the deep inner pocket of his overalls, the movement unhurried and deliberate, stretching the denim over his massive frame. Julian leaned forward, expecting the final, pathetic retreat. Instead of a thick wallet or checkbook, the farmer pulled out a small, battered flip phone, the kind favored by those who needed maximum battery life and minimum digital footprint. He punched 3 quick buttons with a thumb calloused harder than leather. He brought the phone to his ear, waited 2 seconds, and spoke in a low rumble that was barely audible over the hum of the AC. Only 3 words. Then, without explanation, the farmer held the antiquated device out toward Julian. Julian stared at the phone, his mouth slightly open, hesitating to touch the grimy instrument. Was this a sick joke? Was he supposed to call someone? Finally, driven by fear of insulting a potentially powerful client, Julian took the phone with 2 reluctant fingers. He put the receiver to his ear. The 3 words the farmer had spoken were, "Account 774, 3, now." Julian's face instantly drained of all color as the voice on the other end responded, not with a secretary, but with the cool, crisp, utterly professional tone of Eleanor Vance, the Vice President of Corporate Agriculture Lending at First Capital, known exclusively for handling multi-million-dollar private equity acquisitions in the region. Julian dropped the flip phone onto the polished mahogany desk as if it were a live grenade. The cheap plastic clattered against the expensive wood, a stark, vulgar sound in the quiet office. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but a desperate, animalistic instinct of self-preservation immediately kicked in, overriding the terror of hearing Eleanor Vance's chilling, obedient response. He latched onto the only thing he could still control, the narrative of superiority. He had to prove instantly and violently that this farmer was nothing but an interruption, a smear of dirt on his immaculate professional life. Eleanor's voice hadn't just been crisp and professional. Julian realized with a sudden jolt it had been explicitly submissive, taking direction from an unknown voice who spoke 3 blunt, non-negotiable words. This anomaly fueled his panic and his subsequent rage. "Get out," Julian hissed, leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You hear me? Get the hell out of my office. This entire charade is a waste of my time, and frankly, an insult to the institution." He jabbed a furious finger toward the door. "You think you're cute with that little phone trick? You think I don't know who Eleanor Vance works for? People like you don't get to talk to people like her." His voice was rising now, a thin, desperate sound that cracked with the residue of fear. He needed volume to drown out the lingering echoes of Account 774. He straightened his expensive tie, attempting to look powerful. "Seriously, friend? Go home. Come back when you can actually afford a tractor tire, let alone the land you're standing on." The insult was delivered with venomous theatricality, intended to make the farmer flinch, retreat, or at least show some flicker of shame or anger. But the man remained utterly unmoving. His silence was deafening, absorbing Julian's shouted words without acknowledgement. He didn't even blink. His intense, steady gaze didn't waver, but rather seemed to be calculating Julian's reaction speed, cataloging his weak points. This unnerving calm was far more effective than any counter-argument could have been, suggesting the farmer wasn't listening to Julian's words at all, but observing a predictable spectacle. Julian pressed harder, trying to force a reaction, driven by the realization that his outburst hadn't achieved the desired effect. "I said leave. I'm calling security right now to have you escorted off the property before you track more muck into the lobby." As Julian watched the farmer stand there, perfectly composed, he noticed a tiny yet deeply unsettling detail about the man's clothing that his panic had previously overlooked: a microscopic, dark smear on the sleeve of his faded workshirt. It wasn't simple dirt. It looked like heavy machine lubricant, specifically the kind used in the maintenance of high-grade, multi-million-dollar industrial presses, machinery far beyond the scope of a struggling family farm. The implication was a terrifying momentary flash in the back of Julian's mind, quickly suppressed by arrogance. The farmer finally stirred, lifting one hand, not toward Julian, but toward the intercom on the credenza. Julian was about to explode at the audacity when the farmer spoke, his voice the same low, gravelly rumble directed toward the unseen receptionist outside. "Please inform whoever is watching the clock that my assessment is complete, and tell them to notify Julian." The use of Julian's unadorned first name, a familiarity reserved only for those who held real sway within the company's upper echelons, sent a fresh jolt of ice through Julian's veins. He hadn't introduced himself by his first name. He was frozen, the insult about the tractor tire dissolving into ash in his mouth. He dimly registered the farmer reaching into his pocket, not for a check, but for a simple titanium pen. Julian glanced nervously toward his own expensive, Swiss-made wristwatch. He saw a notification flash across the small screen, a private financial alert he had set up only for significant market events, a massive, multi-billion-dollar stock transfer, followed instantly by a red warning signaling a sudden and critical drop in his parent company's share price. The transfer was labeled Account 774. The numbers were now translating into immediate, devastating reality. Julian's bravado completely evaporated. He tried to speak, to apologize, to somehow recall the venom he had just spat out, but the air caught in his throat like broken glass. He looked into the farmer's eyes again, now seeing past the calm. They held a deep, profound regret, not for Julian, but for the necessary act of demolition he was currently performing. The farmer seemed genuinely weary of the power he wielded. The office atmosphere, usually warm and controlled by the expensive climate system, felt suddenly frigid, heavy with unspoken consequence. Julian realized with a horrifying clarity that twisted his stomach that the farmer hadn't come here seeking a loan or seeking mercy. He had come here to assess the value of the collateral, and Julian's entire corporate life, his career, his very future, had been placed on the auction block. The farmer finally moved toward the door, his gait slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried, maintaining that paralyzing eye contact the entire time. Julian could only watch, unable to summon the physical ability to stand or intervene. The farmer reached the door and paused. His massive, calloused hand didn't immediately grasp the knob. Instead, he rested it briefly on the rich, dark wood paneling of Julian's custom-built executive desk. The gesture wasn't aggressive, but proprietary, a final confirmation of ownership. What just happened? Julian managed, his voice barely a whisper, the question ragged and desperate. The farmer turned his head slightly, leaning back just enough for his low voice to carry the answer across the room, heavy with finality. You asked what 3 meant, Julian. The farmer paused, letting the implication sink in. It's the number of hours we allocated for the emergency activation of Corporate Charter Clause 9.03, the clause that allows for immediate executive replacement when the asset manager is deemed grossly negligent or actively hostile toward the principal owner. He pushed the door open slightly, the light from the hallway streaming in, cutting the gloom. That clock ran out exactly 7 seconds ago. With that, the farmer stepped through the doorway, disappearing into the antiseptic efficiency of the corporate hallway without looking back. Julian finally surged forward, stumbling over the rug, desperate to reach the discarded phone. He grabbed the small battered device, his fingers shaking, and brought it immediately to his ear, needing to call Eleanor, needing an explanation, needing reassurance that this was a nightmare from which he would wake. The screen, however, was now completely blank, the battery having died the instant the farmer left the room, the small device suddenly inert and silent, symbolizing the final, irrevocable end of Julian's control. The polished marble of the hallway reflected the fluorescent light with sterile indifference, a stark contrast to the shadowy office Julian now wept inside. The man, no longer just a grizzled farmer, but a figure of unsettling, calculated precision, didn't rush. He stood utterly still for 3 breaths, adjusting the cuff of a suit jacket that had been perfectly hidden beneath his rough canvas coat. He didn't even acknowledge the faint sound of Julian's shuddering gasps filtering through the thick mahogany door. This wasn't a sudden ambush. This was the methodical, final execution of a long-planned siege. He reached into an interior pocket. He produced a sleek titanium-cased satellite phone, not the cheap disposable kind Julian had seen him use previously. It looked expensive, heavy, and crucially, fully powered. With deliberate, almost performative slowness, he punched in a single speed dial. The call connected instantly, ringing only once before a crisp, professional voice answered on the other end, devoid of the usual buffering pleasantries. Section 3, Confirmation Protocol, the voice stated flatly. The man held the phone just below his ear, ensuring every word he spoke was low, clear, and utterly binding. Confirmation received. Initiate the full transfer. Immediate. There was a barely perceptible hesitation on the line, a fraction of a second of surprise, even from a voice trained in crisis management. Sir, the amount required for the acquisition of the Julian Smythe holdings is substantial, necessitating multiple regulatory waivers. We estimated a 48-hour processing window, even with emergency clearance. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on a smudge of dust on the wall, as if minor logistics were an insult to his current focus. Forget the waivers, Marcus. I need the full amount, the entire $4.1 billion wired to the escrow account now. Use the Cayman Trust Reserve. I authorized its full liquidation last Tuesday. The line went silent for a moment, absorbing the shock of the colossal financial maneuver. $4, $1 billion. Julian had only ever managed assets measured in the hundreds of millions. The farmer was operating on an entirely different scale of gravitational pull. Understood. Liquidation initiated. That reserve was established for capital defense, sir. Are you absolutely certain this is the necessary deployment? The man smiled, a cold, tight expression that didn't reach his eyes. Necessary? No. Satisfying? Entirely. And one final urgent instruction, Marcus. He lowered his voice further, the command now laced with a dangerous edge of personal retribution that transcended mere business. Julian Smythe is currently attempting to process the sale of his remaining equity to the competition. He must be stopped. I want an immediate legal injunction placed on his ability to access any corporate account or finalize any transaction related to Smythe Holdings. We own the controlling interest now, but I want his hands tied permanently to the table before he can sign the transfer papers. A full corporate lockdown initiated immediately. Consider it done, sir. What grounds shall we cite for the injunction? Gross negligence under 9.03 as per the earlier activation. Marcus sounded like he was already typing furiously. The man leaned against the marble wall, suddenly looking weary, but the weariness of a general who has just won the longest, hardest battle. No, that's too clean. We cite active, demonstrable fraud against the principal owner. Make sure the affidavit details the manipulation of the land valuations over the last 18 months, the ones he tried to bury in the offshore shell accounts. The silence on the line indicated rapid compliance. The speed dial feature had connected him directly to the head partner of Crestwood & Vance, the largest, most notoriously ruthless corporate law firm on the eastern seaboard, specializing in hostile takeovers and litigation so deep it resembled trench warfare. This was not a bank call. This was the mobilization of a private legal army. Julian, locked in the office, still clutching the dead device, thought he was fighting a man with dirt under his fingernails. The owner of Mid-Atlantic Agribusiness, the actual controlling force behind the 3 largest food processing plants and nearly half the state's grain output, finally let out a slow breath. He was the principal owner of the entire region's farming conglomerate, a man whose shadow stretched across thousands of acres and millions of tons of produce, a scale Julian had never truly grasped. Julian had only ever managed the paper. This man managed the reality. Julian had underestimated the gravity of true wealth, confusing his small corporate titles for genuine influence. And Marcus, when you send the confirmation of the transfer, ensure the final receipt uses the name Elias Thorne, not the corporate shell. I want Julian to read that name when the documents are served. Thorne disconnected the call without waiting for a reply. He wasn't just sealing Julian's fate. He was making sure Julian knew exactly whose boot was resting on his neck. He pocketed the phone, the metallic click echoing slightly in the vast hallway. He turned back toward the office door, not intending to go back in, but pausing to look at the faint, shimmering glow beneath the crack in the door. The corporate lights still shining, oblivious to the financial earthquake that had just occurred inside. The $4.1 billion was now in motion, a digital tsunami sweeping through the financial markets, all to secure assets Julian thought he had cleverly cornered. Julian's entire world was dissolving, not with a bang, but with a simple, quiet keystroke on a highly secure network. Julian, meanwhile, still sat on the floor, attempting uselessly to pry open the back of the inert phone, believing the battery was merely loose. He was oblivious that across town, his primary legal counsel was receiving a catastrophic notification, a complete asset freeze issued by a power they didn't recognize, citing a client, Elias Thorne, they had never heard of, but whose legal filings were immediately backed by the formidable resources of Crestwood & Vance. The paperwork was already printing. The irony was palpable. Julian had spent months trying to squeeze the last remaining cents from the old farmer, convinced he was dealing with simple, exploitable, rural wealth. He hadn't realized the complexity of a man whose fortune was tied not to stocks or debt, but to the fundamental necessity of food production, a stability that dwarfed transient market fluctuations. Thorne's corporation was bedrock. Julian's was sand. Thorne took a final deep breath of the sterile air-conditioned air, savoring the clean scent of victory that smelled nothing like dirt or fields. He had worn the mask of the simple man for years, allowing Julian to believe he was an easy target, cultivating that exact perception of weakness. He allowed Julian to play his greedy games, knowing that every move Julian made was catalogued, audited, and used as ammunition for this precise moment of executive termination. The speed with which the legal machinery mobilized was terrifying. Marcus, the ruthless lawyer on the other end, had already executed the full asset lockdown within 90 seconds of the command, demonstrating a level of preparedness that went beyond standard corporate contingency. There were likely dedicated teams waiting on standby, simply waiting for the confirmation code, Section 3, to unleash the planned devastation. Julian would soon find that his personal bank accounts, the ones he used for his extravagant lifestyle, were also included in the injunction, not because they were legally tied to the corporation, but because Thorne's lawyers had preemptively sought a lien against them, claiming them as potential collateral for the massive damages associated with the fraud accusation. Thorne wasn't just taking the company, he was dismantling the man. A soft chime signaled the arrival of the confirmation text on Thorne's titanium phone. 4100,000 to 1000 as wire transfer complete. Smythe Holdings now secured. Injunction served to counsel. Thorne didn't bother opening the message. He simply started walking toward the elevator, his steps slow and measured, moving away from the silence of the defeated office and into the next phase of his operation, which undoubtedly involved securing the loyalties of the remaining corporate directors Julian had manipulated. He passed a junior security guard standing nervously by the lift. The guard, recognizing the authority radiating from the man, quickly averted his eyes. Thorne paused and gave the guard a measured nod. Inform your supervisor that the ownership structure has changed, effective immediately, and tell him to ensure Mr. Smythe is gently escorted from the premises within the next 5 minutes. He no longer has clearance. The guard, bewildered but obedient, stammered a reluctant, "Yes, sir." He had no idea he was witnessing the final act of a corporate coup, executed by a man who had intentionally dressed like the dirt he owned. The speed of the takeover was designed not just for efficiency, but for psychological shock, ensuring that Julian and anyone who had backed him would understand the utter futility of resistance. The sheer weight of Thorne's financial power had crushed the organization instantaneously. Thorne stepped into the elevator, the polished steel doors closing silently on the scene of his victory. He hadn't bothered to retrieve the canvas coat. It was merely a costume that had served its purpose. His war was over, but Julian's reckoning was just beginning. The full scope of the financial devastation would only become clear when the market opened the following morning, revealing the crater left by the sudden, massive withdrawal from the Cayman trusts. And that crater, Thorne knew, was exactly where Julian's career would be buried. The polished lobby, moments ago a symbol of stable wealth, now felt like the eye of a hurricane. Julian, pale and sweating, was still trying to call Mr. Smythe, the silence on the other end echoing the sudden, terrifying vacuum where his sense of security used to be. He grasped the phone so tightly his knuckles were white, muttering denials into the air. The front door burst open, not with authority, but with desperate speed. It was Mr. Harrison, the dealer manager, his face a map of pure panic, holding a crumpled printout like a death warrant. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the 5 minutes since the news of the massive withdrawal broke across the private wires. The sheer velocity of the capital flight defying logic. Harrison's shirt was already damp with stress, indicating he hadn't even stopped to breathe since seeing the numbers. He was a corporate animal sensing imminent slaughter, and the smell of fear was thick in the air. Harrison knows the scope of the withdrawal, but the panic in his eyes suggests he hasn't yet grasped the mastermind behind it. Harrison bypassed Julian entirely, stumbling toward the closed office door where Thorne was likely waiting. "The Cayman accounts, Julian. What in God's name did you authorize? That's not a fluctuation, that's an extinction event. $500 million gone. We've triggered margin calls across 3 continents. We are facing a liquidity crisis that will tank us by market open tomorrow if we don't stabilize the bleeding immediately," Julian stammered, his voice cracking. I just followed orders. Mr. Smythe said we had to stabilize the portfolio by securing the new trust." "Who is this man, Harrison? Why did he just have Smythe thrown out?" R2. The exact financial magnitude is revealed. $500 million gone, showing Julian's blind, fearful trust in Smythe was a catastrophic error. Harrison stopped dead, finally noticing Thorne standing in the doorway, impeccably dressed now in a sharp, dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. Thorne hadn't moved since leaving the elevator, yet he dominated the space. The transition from the dusty contractor to the corporate titan was absolute. "You," Harrison whispered, recognizing the name now scrolling across every financial news ticker attached to the massive market disruption. "You're Thorne, the one who—" Thorne cut him off with a gesture smoother than glass. "The one who identified the rot and performed the necessary extraction, yes, and who, incidentally, just bought this building, its inventory, its goodwill, and its debts, all settled simultaneously, leveraging the very gap Smythe's negligence created. Congratulations, Harrison, you now report to me." R3. Thorne reveals the coup wasn't just a removal, it was a total asset purchase, executed instantly, making his control irreversible. Julian's knees buckled. He wasn't just in trouble, he was standing on the precise spot where the ground had collapsed, staring into the abyss of his own career. Harrison, seeing the man who had just destroyed the company's financial foundation, suddenly shifted his posture, the desperate fear morphing into a calculated deference, an immediate assessment of the new dominant player. The instinct of a true manager always leans toward the source of power and survival. "Mr. Thorne?" Harrison began, his voice surprisingly steady, masking the tremor in his hands. "I assure you I had no knowledge of any leveraged exposure or unusual transfers associated with Mr. Smythe's private interests. My priority is damage control and ensuring continuity of operations under the new management." R4. Harrison immediately sacrifices Julian to save himself, highlighting the ruthless calculus of corporate survival. Thorne smiled, but it was a cold, surgical expression devoid of warmth. "Damage control is precisely why I'm here, Harrison. And unlike Julian, you seem capable of reading the market and acknowledging a new majority stakeholder when you see one. Let's talk about solutions. I happen to have a pending order that, if processed immediately and without friction, would inject substantial liquidity back into this firm. A multi-million-dollar transaction. The kind that stabilizes jittery investors and buys us time before the SEC starts asking uncomfortable questions about market manipulation and fiduciary failure." R5. The massive pending deal is introduced, but its urgency is tied directly to legal threats and the looming investigation by the SEC. Harrison's eyes went wide with a fragile, desperate hope. He saw a lifeline thrown just as the ship was sinking. "A multi-million-dollar deal now. What is it, sir?" "We can authorize anything you need pending legal review, of course. We need cash flow now to cover those margin calls." Thorne leaned against the doorframe, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "No review necessary. It's simple. I'm buying the entire fleet of specialty imports that arrived this morning, every single vehicle. Payment wired instantly from Zurich." He paused, letting the sheer financial weight settle on them. "But there's one non-negotiable term, Harrison. One condition that must be met before I press the final button on the transfer." R6. The scope of the transaction, the entire new import fleet, is revealed, showing Thorne's capacity for massive, immediate spending, which dwarfs the firm's immediate losses. Julian finally found his voice, high-pitched and frantic, a desperate squeak. "Condition? Wait, Mr. Thorne, I can fix this. I can manage the fleet transfer. I know the logistics. I built the client book. I'm essential." Harrison silenced him with a sharp, lethal look, the look of a drowning man kicking away a weaker swimmer to reach the surface. Thorne watched the interaction with detached amusement, confirming his assessment of both men. "The condition," Thorne stated, folding his hands, his gaze locking onto Harrison, "is that Julian will personally wash my truck, the old F-150 out front, bumper to tailpipe, by hand. If he misses a spot, or if he takes longer than it takes for the funds to clear, which is 30 seconds, the deal is nullified. You choose, Harrison, your firm's survival or your VP's pride." Harrison didn't hesitate. He grabbed Julian by the arm, dragging the protesting man toward the exit. "Have you heard him? Go! Now!" Julian, tears mixing with the humiliation, stumbled out, heading for the humble, dusty truck that held their financial fate. Thorne didn't watch the scrubbing. The lesson was already taught. He gave a slight nod to the trembling Harrison. "The transfer is complete. Enjoy your fleeting solvency." He turned, walking out of the sterile high-rise office and past the shattered reflection of Julian, kneeling in the parking lot, hands stained with mud and desperation. Thorne climbed into the F-150, the engine humming a quiet, powerful tune. He looked one last time at the glass tower, where men measured worth in tailored suits and shiny cars, oblivious to the fact that the real kings often preferred camouflage. He shifted into drive, pulling smoothly onto the highway, leaving the immediate bitter taste of instant karma washing over them. Some men learn too late that the deepest pockets often wear the plainest clothes, and that karma, unlike cash flow, is always settled instantly. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into consequence, please like this video, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button for more masterful tales of revenge and realization. We'll see you in the next story.